Congressman Brad Wenstrup, the chair of the subcommittee on lockdown and the pandemic. Welcome again to the Bill Cunningham Show. And before we get into specifics, I have the transcripts here. Can you give me the overview as the chair of the committee, what Randy Weingartner, head of the teachers union, what she said in its vacation from reality?
Yeah, well, first of all, their hearing, it was certainly the opportunity to set us up for what's called a transcribed interview. You're a lawyer, you know what that is. So we will be having her back. But what we came with was very clear. We know it. She knows it. She even said it. That the American Federation of Teachers is a political organization. They're not a medical organization, and I don't believe that they're for the service of educating America's children by and large in that part of the organization. You know, the CDC opened the door to the American Federation of Teachers, which was uncommon access. You know, they don't have medical guidance, although Randy Weingarten said, yeah, we spoke to some physicians. She couldn't name them, and she couldn't say what guidance they actually gave. But all of their guidance and all of their communications that we found, especially between amongst themselves and then with the CDC, they were always pushing for closure of schools, not opening of schools. Never were they saying, what do we need to do to get open? It actually, and I'll use their word, they said, we need a trigger. And this is on their internal documents. We need a trigger for schools to be closed. And we should use community transmission rates, not in-school transmission rates. Well, they're markedly different, and that's the thing. The community was far different. You were safer in school than you were out in the community. But they never were saying, you know, we must get the kids back in school, that education is essential, and we're essential to that. You know, you saw doctors and nurses dealing with all the high-risk conditions out there, but teachers and students were at the lowest risk. And the teachers union came out and said, well, we want to be vaccinated first. Okay, well, as a nation, we gave teachers the opportunity to go to the front of the line, and then when they got it, that wasn't good enough. And Bill, the real problem is why so many schools were open, they were continuing to push for closure. You know, my kids at a Catholic school, they didn't miss a day once the fall of 2020 came around. But the people who suffered the most in this country were really the children, especially those of low to moderate income, because parents couldn't go to work. They had to stay home with their kids. They didn't have access to other conditions that would let their kids be taken care of. But they suffered academically, physically, and mentally, and all this while others were open. And we're also concerned, you know, where do the funds go? And why did some of the funds go to non-COVID related things like new gymnasiums or curriculum that certainly is arguably and probably raises? And the Democrats never looked at any of this, while they were in charge. But here's the next question. Why did the CDC, you have a physician in charge there, Dr. Walensky, why did she just accept the guidelines that they put over? They put them in word for word without a discussion that we can find of whether it was a good idea, was it based on science, who were they protecting? And the next question is, was this a direction from the White House to the CDC? Yeah.
Well, one of the best parts of your subcommittee was Congressman Miller Meeks did a great job from Iowa.
Yeah.
She said, quote, did your scientific experts present to you as of June of 2020, among 1.8 million children in this age group, you know how many died in that age group? And then Weingartner said, quote, I don't have that number in my head. Miller Meeks then answered her own question saying, well, the number is 0. And, you know, all hell broke loose in March, February, March, April. That is when, what have we got? Is it cholera? Is it the bubonic plague? Is it flu? Is it a cold? Is it big? Is it not? But certainly in the summer of 20, we knew exactly what we dealt with, in which there was a limited number of people at risk. But the teachers union, in close consult with the CDC and Dr. Walensky, did everything in their power to close schools down, but she testified differently, didn't she?
Yeah, and and Randy Weingartner finally had to admit, but she had to be pressed, she has Dr. Walensky's direct number. And as Congresswoman Lesko said, oh, well, I'm on 2 committees that deal with the CDC, and I don't have her number. Maybe I can get that. She tried to spin around it, and she knew that she couldn't because she was under oath. So you can just see, and look, you look at their numbers of where they donate, who they donate to. As I pointed out, I think 6 of the 7 Democrats on the committee have received funds from the teachers union. Okay, they're a union. That's what they do, and they're a political organization. But you got to admit it, and they should have no business giving guidelines to the CDC and just having them accepted without some medical backing behind it, and there clearly wasn't any.
Now, you said in your opening statement, quote, the baseline question should have been, schools need to be open. Are we doing everything we can to make that happen? And you added that the recommendation in February of 2021, when Biden seized power, the school reopening guidance in the Biden administration kept 90% of schools fully from reopening at that time. The recommendations Wenstrup named were use of community spread rates to determine reopening instead of the risk to children and the teachers. That was a key difference, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you might as well just look at the people that were most vulnerable, the people that had comorbidities. That had nothing to do with what was going on in the schools. And like I said, it's not like other schools weren't open. They were. But, it brings to the point why you see more people going for school choice. They're going for homeschooling. There's a lot of reasons for this, but certainly to private schools. Bill, I was with local heads of the NAACP a few years ago, and I asked them what they thought about school choice. They said, oh, we're against it. And then when I asked them where their kids went to school, they both were in private schools.
Of course. Don't do as I say, but don't do as I do, do as I say. And when you talk to congressmen, represent NAACP, whatever it is, whatever group that says we have to hurt private schools and school choice, they themselves do exactly the opposite of what their policies would seem to indicate, and it doesn't stop. Quote, this is also from you at the hearing. It made sense to consult with the CDC. It was only appropriate for the CDC to confer with educators. It would have been reprehensible not to have done so. So the consultation, yes, talk to them, but at the end of the day, the teachers' unions are not medical facilities. What they are unions that advocate for higher wages and better working conditions for their teacher, and that's why they exist.
We had a hearing with one of the leaders from the School Nurses Association, and she was the Democrat witness, and she basically said the schools should have been open, as though they were ready to go, and clearly not the case. And this has got to come to reality for America, and I hope people understand it because their kids were affected. And there's no plan. Do you ever see them come up with a plan to really get the kids caught up?
No.
I mean, basically what we did in those schools is you had sixth grade teachers to teach fourth graders. Well, that's impossible. That is too much to make up, and I'm not sure how they're dealing with it except for possibly just moving them along, which is even more dangerous.
Social promotion, you and I know it's your responsibility as chair of the select committee on the coronavirus pandemic, but that is that it is obvious. We live in a little part of America called Cincinnati, and the Archdiocese of Cincinnati schools have about 37,000 students. CPS, Cincinnati Public Schools, have 35,000 students. The 37,000 were in school, being taught by teachers in the school. They lost nothing. The 35,000 at CPS are anywhere from 1 to 3 years behind, and there's no attempt to make sure that a third grader can read. I can't imagine being in school in Chicago, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Austin. I can't imagine being in school. And how about Portland or Los Angeles, San Francisco? How far those kids are behind, just naturally way behind. And then you take them out of school for a year and a half to 2 years, they can't read. And how many kids, the great majority of public school kids, graduate in Chicago that are functionally illiterate? And there's no attempt to say we got to be open an additional 6 weeks in the summer. If you're a second or third grader, you will get a reading guarantee if you go to Chicago Public Schools. Hear any talk from Randy Weingartner about that?
And the only way you get better is if you're willing to look at the mistakes that you made and admit to them. But if your motives were political, if your motives were personal, rather than just not having the right data or something like that, then we have a huge problem. And you've got to look back, and that's what this committee's trying to do, look back at everything that was done. And it's reasonable for us in an oversight role to question the motives behind decisions. And I think we're getting there. And for people like Randy Weingarten and Anthony Fauci, the wagons are going to circle around them because I saw a deposition with Anthony Fauci because he's getting sued by Louisiana and Missouri 174 times. He said he doesn't remember when asked questions. Well, there's a lot of people around him that do remember. And now as he's starting to remember, he's remembering things differently than they actually happened.
Well, Fauci defied anyone to prove that he closed down a single school or a single business. And then go to the tape. He told President Trump to, quote, shut the country down on television countless times to warn against red states opening their schools too early. He went on television to condemn people who wanted to open schools in the so-called red states. And so thank God we have that. Secondly, you're a congressman, a doctor, in addition to being a representative and a retired soldier with great distinction, many medals. And on the House committee that you serve, Intelligence, there's now a push by the Biden administration to have battery-operated tanks. I can only imagine in a battle with battery-operated tanks and troop carriers and Bradley fighting vehicles, what is the Biden administration now talking about putting batteries in tanks?
Well, first of all, the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of tanks, battery-operated, I think of the Russian tanks that were just stranded on the side of the road. Why? Because they didn't have gas. They didn't have energy. Our batteries, our electric vehicles rely on China. We can't produce these vehicles without China contributing to the process in the making of the battery. We don't do that. We no longer have that type of technology. We've given up our mines. You know, we have one rare earth mine and it has zero capability to process rare earth minerals. So in other words, we can mine them, we can't process them. This is California's Mountain Pass, and it's 1/10 owned by a Chinese investor. But it's across the board, and we are stuck on pharmaceuticals, on energy, and if we're going to make this push, we need to make sure that we can be a 100% domestic and strong in our capabilities if we're going to push something, especially for our military. I mean, I became greatly concerned during COVID when the reality came around that as I served in Iraq, that my protective equipment and my pharmaceuticals, battlefield medicines, relied on China. Now, how do we manage that? If they decide to take us down, they're not going to have to fire a shot. We're in a position today where they can do so many things to just shut us down. It's been estimated that if they stop producing the minerals and other products of just making of generic medicines, we're done in 2 months. We have nothing. And what a great opportunity for sabotage. The FDA isn't over in the Chinese labs to make sure these medicines are okay. And there's been multiple times where the medicines have been tainted. 15 years ago, about 250 Americans died from tainted heparin that China produced. And yet they still go on and they have no liability. But, you know, you look at this idea of electric vehicles and all the stuff going on right now in the effort of green energy. And, look, I'm for all of the above.
Right.
And there's been a lot of things that have happened. We passed the Clean Air Act years ago, and a great deal of progress has been made. And, you know, but I want to bring up something. You know, when you go out in the sun, you put on sunblock because you don't want skin cancer. Yet at the same time, it's healthy for you to get some vitamin D from the sun. And also, as a doctor, I could prescribe a medication that might kill the virus and bacteria in you, but if it kills you too, it really doesn't help you. And so it's interesting, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has a 40-year study that they came out with last year. They said, well, we've cleaned up pollution so well over the Atlantic that there's actually more hurricanes and storms and warming.
Say that again. Say that again.
Yeah. Over the last 40 years, over the Atlantic Ocean, we have cleaned up the air so much that there are actually more hurricanes and storms because we've heated the water, which creates the energy for those. In other words, Bill, we've cleaned it up so much that there's no particulate matter up there anymore that used to serve as a block. Now it's like a magnifying glass. So it does. So that does create global warming. And in the Pacific, hurricanes and storms have gone down where the particulate pollution has gone up.
Because of China.
So I've said this in the committee. I said, you know, if you talk about science, you know, I'm all for science, but let's really talk about all of it. Sometimes we can overdo it and maybe make things worse. And, there's just so many things in this arena and with energy that are so important. I remember being in Chicago for a Reds Cubs series 25 years ago or so, and they had a brownout. And it was so bad, 500 people died in their apartments. So you see the importance of energy to keep you alive. Go through a hospital and look at all the monitors and everything that's there. It all relies on energy. And their backup is generators. So let's not kill ourselves by doing too much. I'm all for clean air, clean water. So are you. You remember when you couldn't see the tops of buildings in Los Angeles.
Right.
We've come a long way. But sometimes you have to take a look and say, have we done too much? Maybe
it's a religion.
We have.
It's a religion. It's a belief. I potted up this story. Reducing human-caused air pollution in North America and Europe brings surprise result, more hurricanes. Because of the pollution caused by China, there's less hurricanes in the Pacific. There's more because of what we've done. It's the law of unintended consequences. And what Biden is doing is making China great again, with rare earth minerals and also solar panels only coming out of communist red China, and also the $31 million or so that the Chinese, the Russians, and the Ukrainians put in the Biden bank accounts, which hopefully that'll metastasize. But, Congressman, we got to go. Brad Wenstrup of Ohio, keep doing what you're doing. We're not getting the truth. If we had a real Attorney General, there would be perjury charges filed against Weingartner and against Dr. Anthony Fauci, but it's not going to happen now. But thank you for coming on, and thank you for doing what you're doing. The mainstream media largely doesn't cover all this, but the 15 to 20% that listen to those of us that care about facts do. But Congressman Brad Wenstrup, doctor and soldier, once again, thank you for coming on the Bill Cunningham Show, and with your permission, we'll do it again. Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Doctor.
Yes, sir.